Hey everyone, this is Pastor Tori, and this is our second Bible study. We are going through a Bible study called, an overview of the Bible. And last week we did kind of a flyover, um, really basic flyover of the basics of everything from Genesis to Revelation. And this week, we're going to go back to the beginning and start talking about the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Pentateuch. That's the fancy name for the Torah or the Law of Moses, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And so I wanted to pull up some notes here on the side before we get started. And last week, we talked about how, let me get the little thing going. Last week, we talked about how the Bible is arranged in genres, kind of like a library. You have nonfiction and fiction sections, and the Bible is arranged like that. You have sections of the Bible. Now, in the Old Testament, they have genres, and the sections in there are the Pentateuch. They have poetry, history, and prophecy. And today, we are talking about the Pentateuch, which covers Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the first question that is probably the most important question to ask is, or the questions I should say, is who wrote it, when it was written, and why was it written? Now, growing up, I thought that, since it's the book of Moses, that Moses wrote all 5 of these books, that he was in the desert with all of these people and he sat on a rock and he wrote down all these stories and all these laws and everything that is in these first 5 books. And that's really not the truth. The truth is that it was probably not written by Moses. Maybe pieces of it were written by him, but most of it was written by other people. Scholars date the Pentateuch to be written between the 10th and the 6th centuries BCE, which is kind of that time period where Assyria was attacking the northern kingdom and Babylon was attacking the southern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom was taking it into exile, the stuff that we talked about last week. And so it was mostly written and compiled and arranged during this time. And multiple authors spanning hundreds of years had their input into these books. They took oral stories from their traditions, and they took written material and they gathered them together, they organized it, and they pieced it together to create these books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, when was it written? Scholars date the Pentateuch to be written between the 10th and 6th centuries, like I said before. And part of the Pentateuch was written during the time of Babylon captivity. They were asking themselves questions, and we're going to cover those questions in a little bit. Well, we're covering them in the next slide. Why was it written? To answer these questions. They were asking the questions, who are we as a people? Where did we come from? What is God like? What is our God like? What is Yahweh like? And why do bad things happen? Why were we taken into captivity? Why are these things happening to us? And are we still God's people? And today is all about story. I'm going to tell you stories, basically an overview from Genesis to the end of Exodus. And I am covering nowhere near what everything is in these 2 books, but we're going to try to do our best, like I said last week, to do kind of a flyby overview of what all is happening and getting a general sense of what Israel's story is. In Genesis, when we look at the book and open it up in the first probably 11 chapters, we will find stories such as creation and Adam and Eve, the origin of sin, Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel. These are all called origin stories. This is these are stories that you can find in other types of cultures. Babylon has their origin stories. They have a story of the flood. They have a creation story. Native Americans have creation stories, and they also have flood stories. Sumerians, the earliest people, um, have creation and flood stories. And so these types of stories can be found in all different types of cultures. And in Genesis, the Hebrews wrote their version of creation and Adam and Eve and the flood, the first people, the Tower of Babel, of where language came from. This was their way of answering some of these questions. Why do bad things happen? What is God like? And so these stories were created to answer some of those questions. Let's go into after what happens after these creation and all of these origin stories happen. Genesis tells about the first family, the family, um, Israel's family tree, which starts with Abraham and Sarah. And I'm going to try to do some sense of a family tree. It kind of gets chaotic and a little bit um, confusing, but hopefully I did it in a way where people can follow the story. So after chapter 11 in Genesis, it goes into Israel's family tree. And the first people they talk about is Abraham and his wife Sarah. God calls Abraham out of his country into a new land where God will show him God's ways. And Sarah cannot have a child. Now, in ancient culture, women, um, women's purpose was to have children, to create heirs for their husbands. That is an ancient tribal culture. And Sarah was not able to have a child. And so Sarah went to Abraham and said, "You know what? Use my slave, Hagar, to produce a child, to produce an heir for us." And so Abraham slept with Hagar, and Hagar produced a child called Ishmael. And later on, Sarah did conceive, and she conceived a son named Isaac. And there are stories in Genesis where Sarah finds Ishmael, who is older than Isaac, picking on Isaac. And so Sarah tells Abraham to send Hagar away, send her away into the desert. And so that is what Abraham does. He sends Hagar and Ishmael away. And there is a tradition that says that Hagar and Ishmael became the people of the Muslim faith and the Muslim traditions. And that is the ancestor that we have in common is Abraham. So when they speak of Allah, the question is, do we serve the same God? Well, according to tradition, if they come from Hagar and Ishmael, and Christians and people of the Jewish faith come from Isaac, our father, our common father, is Abraham, who served Yahweh. And so it seems that Yahweh and Allah are the same God. Uh, some people will disagree with that, but according to the family tree of Israel, that is what happened. So the Bible follows the story not of Hagar and Ishmael, but that follows the story of Isaac. And so Isaac marries a woman named Rebecca. And they have two children. One, they have twins, actually. They have Esau and they have Jacob. Esau comes out first. He is the oldest. So he is the one that gets the inheritance. He's the one that gets the family blessing. He's top dog. But what happens is that Jacob is a little bit of a trickster, and so is his mom, Rebecca. And so Jacob ends up tricking Esau out of his birthright, out of his inheritance, and Jacob gets it all. And so the Esau says, I'm going to kill you, Jacob, and Jacob runs. And Rebekah sends Jacob to her uncle Laban. And he gets to Laban's house, and Jacob meets two sisters, Leah and Rachel. Leah is older, Rachel is younger. He falls in love with Rachel. And he makes a deal with Laban and says, hey, I want to marry Rachel. I will work 7 years for her. And Laban says, great, I'm going to work 7 years. So 7 years pass, he marries Rachel, and the wedding happens, and they go consummate their marriage in the wedding bed. And the next morning he wakes up, and there before him is not Rachel, but it is her older sister, Leah. Jacob married Leah. And so Jacob is mad, and he goes back to Laban and says, what did you do? And Laban says, well, it's tradition in our culture that the oldest girl marries first. And so if you want to marry Rachel now, work for another 7 years. And so that's what Jacob does. And it seems that Jacob has met his match, Jacob being this trickster out of tricking Esau out of his birthright, now seems to be the one that is being tricked by his uncle Laban. So now Jacob is married to two women, Leah and Rachel, sisters. Now I want to have a little side note. I don't know why I put this in here, but Jacob is later renamed Israel, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So now we have Jacob marrying two women, two sisters, and a rival begins to happen. And what I said before is that in ancient times, the purpose of the woman in a relationship is to have children and have heirs for the husband. And we have very different views nowadays, but in the ancient culture, that is what women thought their purpose was. So Leah begins having children, and she has Reuben, she has Simeon, she has Levi, and Judah. Now, after the fourth child, Rachel is thinking, my husband is going to hate me because I cannot bear any children, and Leah is going to be his favorite. So she goes to Jacob and says, I want to have an heir. So why don't you sleep with my slave? Sound familiar? That's exactly what Sarah did with Abraham. Sleep with my slave, Bilhah, and produce an heir for me or for us. And so he did. He slept with Bilhah, and she had a child named Dan, and then she had another child named Naphtali. And then Leah says, oh, we're playing this game. Okay, Jacob, why don't you sleep with my slave and produce more children for me? And so Jacob did that, and she had Zilpah had Gad and Asher, and then Leah had more children, Issachar, Zebulun, and then a daughter named Dinah. And then finally, Rachel had Joseph. And then later on, she had Benjamin, and Rachel died in childbirth when she was having Benjamin. So when we look at this family, and Jacob is in love with Rachel, who do you think the favorite of the family is? Now, normally you would think Reuben. He is the oldest. He is the first. He is the heir. He's the firstborn. But that's not the case with Jacob. His first love, or his favorite, is Joseph, because he is the oldest son of the woman that he loves. And so Joseph is his favorite. And this is where it comes in for those who have ever watched or listened to Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Some of you might have seen Donny Osmond in the show. This is kind of the story of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, because the scripture and the story in the Bible in Genesis follows Joseph's story. And so now Joseph has these dreams. He's a big dreamer. And he has these dreams of stalks of wheat that are straight up, that are his stalks of wheat. And then he says there's other stalks of wheat that are his brothers, and that his brothers' stalks of wheat bow down to his. Well, Joseph's had these dreams about everything bowing down to him, especially his brothers, and being subject to him. Well, his brothers don't necessarily like that. And Joseph is kind of dumb too, because he tells his brothers his dreams. His brothers get angry, and so they decide to kill him. But Reuben steps up and says, no, you're not going to kill him. And so what they do is they throw him in a pit. And then some people come along on their way to Egypt, and they end up selling Joseph as a slave to these people who are headed to Egypt. Meanwhile, taking the story and saying to his father, well, a wild animal killed Joseph. We couldn't do anything about it. And so now Joseph goes to Egypt, and he is a slave there. And there's a number of stories that happen during that time while he is a slave and imprisoned, and he's still having these dreams. And Pharaoh begins having these nightmares, and he doesn't know what they mean. And so he says, is there anyone that can help me interpret these? And somebody says, ooh, we know of one guy. He's in the prison. His name is Joseph. He can interpret dreams. So Joseph goes before Pharaoh. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and he says, you know what? Your dreams mean you're going to have 7 years of really good crops. But then the next 7 years, it's going to be a famine. So you have to prepare the first 7 years in order to get through the second 7 years. And the Pharaoh is like, you're brilliant. Of course, this is what it means. Why don't you be in charge of doing that? Help us prepare for this famine. And Joseph becomes the second most powerful person in Egypt under Pharaoh. So Joseph has all of this power, and he works for those 7 years, and then the famine hits. And nobody in the area, in the land, has any food except for Egypt. So what do people do when they're hungry and they want to get food? You go where the food is. So you have people coming from all over going to Egypt. And guess who shows up? Joseph's brothers show up to Egypt, hoping to get food. Now, I'm not going to tell you the big dramatic story of everything that happened between Joseph and his brothers. Long story short, Joseph's brothers don't recognize that it's Joseph. So Joseph kind of plays with them a little bit, messes with their head, and makes them go back and forth a few times. And finally, at the end, he reveals himself as their brother. They're ecstatic, they're shocked. They can't believe it's him. Joseph says, go get my father. Is he alive? And they said, yes, he's alive. So they bring the whole family up to Egypt so that they can be safe, so that they can have food to eat to make it through the famine. And they settle in a land called Goshen. And it's some of the most fertile land in Egypt. And that's where Joseph and his family live. That's where Jacob's family, who is named Israel, is living. And that is where the book of Genesis ends. So we're already through Genesis. Then Exodus picks up where Genesis left off. And it begins in Egypt. And it says that years later, a new Pharaoh rose to power. A new Pharaoh that didn't know anything about Joseph. And he saw all these Hebrews, Israelites, living in this land of Goshen. And he's starting to realize that they are growing and growing and growing and getting bigger. And he gets scared and says, what if these people decide to turn on us? They could kill us all. So, what he does is that he puts them into slavery. He tries to control them. And then, um, oh, there's the story. There's the story of Pharaoh commanding that all babies 2 and under be thrown into the Nile so that they can have a population control. And so that is what they do. But there is one woman who gives birth to a baby named Moses, and she creates this little reed basket and she floats it down the Nile. And it happens to be Pharaoh's daughter who finds Moses, this little baby, raises it as her own. And it ends up that Moses's real mother ends up feeding Moses. And so there's some type of, it seems like Moses in the story knows that he is a Hebrew. He knows his history, he knows his past, but he also knows that he is royalty growing up in this palace. So he has these two lives. And it seems like in the story he knows that. So Moses is born. That's his childhood. He has these two separate lives going on where he knows he's a Hebrew, and yet he's in this palace. And there's a story where Moses is older and he is out and about and he sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he gets mad and he kills the Egyptian and hides his body. And it says, the story says that it's the next day where he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he goes to break up the fight and tells them not to fight. And the Hebrews say, well, what are you going to do to us? Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? And then Moses gets scared. And so he runs because he thinks that Pharaoh is going to kill him. So he runs for his life, and he goes to a land called Midian, and he rebuilds a life there. And I want to show you a map. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you will see Lower Egypt. It says Lower Egypt, and then underneath you'll see Goshen. And that's supposedly where the Hebrews, the Israelites, lived. And it was part of Egypt. And then you can see in the bottom right-hand corner is Midian. And that is where Moses ran to. That's where he rebuilt his life. He met a wife. He became a shepherd. He worked for his wife's father. And this is where the story of the burning bush takes place. Moses is up in the hillside, and he is taking care of animals, and he runs across a burning bush. And God speaks out of this bush and tells him to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And this is a fascinating little kind of almost comical story, because Moses is saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And he makes every excuse in the book to try to get out of not going. And finally, he has to give in because he's out of excuses. And so he goes back. He goes back to Egypt, and he tells Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh says no. And so this is where the plagues come in. You have the locusts, you have the river of blood, you have, I think, like 10 different plagues going on. And the last plague is the death of the firstborn. And the story says that God tells the Hebrews to kill an unblemished lamb, and to take the blood and smear it on the doorposts, and then to take the lamb and cook it a certain way and eat all of it. And then that night, God will know to pass over that home, because there's blood on the doorpost. And if there's not blood on the doorpost, the firstborn will die. And it wasn't the firstborn of the human of humans only, but it was the firstborn of livestock and everything. And this is the origin of Passover for the Jewish people. And that is one of their major, major holidays. After the last plague, where the firstborn is killed, the son of Pharaoh dies. And I think that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, per se, when Pharaoh let them go finally. And Israel, Hebrews, they left and they wandered the desert. And in their desert wanderings, there are these epic tales that are told. There's a tale of crossing the Red Sea. The sea parts and they go through on dry ground. There's an epic tale of this golden calf that they make, and that they start worshiping the golden calf. And the tale of Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up and gets the 10 Commandments and comes down and gives it to the people. And this is where a lot of the epic stories are told. And this is the time where God is preparing his people for the promised land. They're not ready for the promised land. They need to know how to worship God. They need to get to know this God. They've been in Egypt for so long. They know the Egyptian gods, but here is God, the one God, monotheistic, and they don't know how to worship this God. And so a lot of this time spent in the desert is them learning to worship, how to worship, who is this God, and it is God preparing them for the promised land. And then at the end of Exodus, they have the tabernacle is kind of the primitive form of the temple. It's a tent, it's portable, and it gives the dimensions of the tent and how this tent or tabernacle is supposed to look, and then it describes all the elements that are to be made within within certain rules that get placed in this tabernacle. I hope that makes sense. And that is how Exodus ends. So that is the big epic story of Genesis and Exodus. I hope that wasn't too boring and that I described that well enough for it to make sense. But I wanted to do it in a where I wasn't sitting here talking for an hour about all these stories. But if you're curious about these stories, there are some really entertaining and epic stories that are in Genesis and Exodus. Okay, let's go to Leviticus, our favorite book. I told the Bible study this morning that I have started reading the Bible from front to back a few times. And I have read the Bible, the entire Bible several times, all of it. But when I start reading from the beginning and start going to the end, I get stuck in Leviticus. Genesis and all the stories are great. Then you get to Exodus and you hear all the stories and they're great. Then you get to Leviticus and now you're reading all these laws and rules and it just gets painful. And so Leviticus is a lot of rules and a lot of laws. And so we're going to do a little bit. We're not going to go really deep into it, but wanted to give you an overview of what is contained in the book of Leviticus. There are types of offerings and sacrifices. It describes the offerings, it describes the sacrifices, it tells you exactly how to do them and why they're doing them. So offerings and sacrifices are covered under Leviticus. You also have rules that the priests must follow, how they dress, what they need to do before they give a sacrifice, rules that they have to follow in order to be a priest. And then there is rules for purification. my Sunday sermon talks about Jesus and the Pharisees following Jesus around, following him and his disciples around, and Jesus and his disciples fail to wash their hands properly, the correct way, and it violates the purification rules that they have in Leviticus. And so the Pharisees call out Jesus and say, "Nope, that's wrong. Why do you do it that way? You didn't do this." And that's this whole story of Jesus talking back to them and talking about how it's not about what's on the outside, it's about what's on the inside. But what they're talking about in the story of Jesus goes back to Leviticus and the purification rules. And then the fourth one is rules for treating people decently. And I don't think I need to explain myself on that one. It's basically how to get along with people. Then we have Numbers. Numbers gives a description of the desert camp. So there's a number of stories in there about the Israelites being in the desert, or the Hebrews being in the desert. And one of the things in the beginning of Numbers is the description of the desert camp. The tabernacle is in the middle, and then all the tribes of Israel are placed around them, and they have a certain camp that they have to be in. They just can't pitch a tent anywhere. They are in clans. So Reuben's clan is over on the east side, and Gad's clan is over on the north side, and it's just gives a pretty detailed description of where they need to camp around this tent. It also gives descriptions of various laws and descriptions of various festivals. Sometimes in the New Testament, you will read that Jesus is on his way with his disciples to a certain festival, like a festival of booths. Passover is a festival. And so it gives all these descriptions of all these festivals and why they celebrate them. And then last but not least, I didn't know how else to put this. Numbers is a weird book because it gives these, there's almost no order to it. Now all of a sudden you're reading this weird story about them being in a desert, and the ground opens up and swallows a bunch of people, or this animal starts talking, and you're like, how is this supposed to make any sense? And it's not supposed to make sense from beginning to end. It is just disorganized, weird stories of Israel in the desert. And I don't know how else to explain that. And then finally, we have Deuteronomy. And I call this is my title for this. Deuteronomy is Moses's big, long speech. And this is supposedly Moses speaking. And it's Moses recapping the past. And then he gives a reminder to obey what God has taught them, meaning the Israelites. And then he reviews all the rules, and then he gives a blessing, and then he dies. And so again, probably not written by Moses, but written and compiled by a number of probably priests who put that together. And that is it for this week. I know that was a lot, but like I said, this week is all about story. And hopefully I told the story in a way that wasn't too detailed, but yet gave you an idea of from the origin stories all the way up to the end of Exodus, where Moses dies and they're ready to go into the promised land. So Genesis is origin stories, and then the family tree of the first family of Abraham, and Exodus is all about the wandering in the desert. And I hope that makes sense. So next week we talk about the books of history. And one of the books of history is Joshua, which is the next book after Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua is next. And Joshua is filled with a lot of violence, a lot of murdering, a lot of genocide. And it begs the question, is God like that? Did God really tell the Israelites to go into this land and kill every man, woman, child? Um, is that God? And really asking the question, is the God of the Old Testament the God of the New Testament? And what should we believe? That's a big question. And kind of coming to terms with God being so destructive in the Old Testament and God being so loving through Jesus in the New Testament. How is that supposed to even make sense? So that's what we will be going through next week. And I hope you can join us. Bible studies on Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. at church. And I hope you guys have a really good week. I'll talk to you later. Bye.